Leaders, we've talked about most of the effects. Let's just summarize them though. They allow you to force march. They provide modifiers in combat. They allow mobilization. And they don't cost stacking. The command boxes, these are just a convenience. Losing leaders. All right. If leaders are alone in a hex, they have a combat strength of 1, which can be used defensively. If they take any losses, then the attacking player has the option of killing or capturing the leader. Also, if you capture the city they're in, or if you attack a force that they're commanding, they don't get that extra 1 point of strength. That's just their ability to run away, basically, although somebody could get killed or something. Then they can also be killed or captured at the whim of the player taking them. Now, if they're captured, you have to keep a guard on them, and you can exchange them for money, for whatever. Whenever a leader is killed, there's a quantity of morale points that get cost. And if you kill it during combat, i.e. choose not to capture it, the winning player in the combat gets the morale points. But if you execute them, that doesn't seem to happen. So there's a reason not to hold things captive, which is kind of cool because most games, you almost always want to capture things. This one, you probably don't. Unless you think you can come to some sort of agreement, you don't want to worry about it. Okay. Unnamed leaders, though, when they're killed, and here capturing them is kind of insanely powerful, so I would say they shouldn't be allowed to be captured. They come back 2 months later. You could capture them and hold them forever. And just as a house rule, I don't allow that because okay, you get a roll to see if they're not guaranteed to come back. They get a roll to come back. And there's a replacement table based on their value. Okay. Each Roman faction has an imperator. Other non-Roman factions may have a rex. This has a greater morale effect than other leaders. In the Roman Civil War, if you lose your imperator, you might have a replacement for him. If you lose everyone who could become an imperator to your faction, you face dissolution and your forces end up going to other players. The treasury is considered to be with the imperator or rex. If you don't have such a character anymore or at all, your treasury is with your highest valued leader. And you have to distinguish which of those leaders it is as the player. If you're killed or captured in land combat, the opposing player gets a quarter of the treasury, another quarter is lost, and the original player gets to keep the other 50% it wasn't really with the leader. Otherwise, if you're killed or captured not in combat, it's a 50-50 split. Okay, morale. Each power has morale at the beginning of the scenario. Whenever you lose any units, pretty much for any reason, you lose its stacking value in morale. Whenever you lose a province, you lose the tax value of that province in morale. Leaders have a cost which ranges from 1 morale point plus the value of the leader. An imperator or rex, a named leader will cost twice that much. An imperator or rex will cost 10 times that base value. Not 10 times twice as much, even though it's worded kind of that way, but the example shows it. Likewise, when you eliminate an enemy leader in combat, that's the key thing, not a capture and execution later, you gain those points. Anytime you retreat before combat, you lose 5 morale points. If you don't make an attack during a summer game turn, you lose 5 morale points. You just have to declare the attack. You don't have to actually succeed in it. The enemy can run away. Assaulting an enemy city is making an attack. You don't have to make attacks in winter. You don't inactive minor powers don't have to worry about morale. If you win a combat, that's worth 2 morale. If you lose, it's worth 2. In addition to anything else, because some of them, some of the combat results are NN here, so you wouldn't be seeing any points change hands in that if it weren't for this. The imperial capital. Early in the game, Rome will be the imperial capital. Later on, a number of other cities become capitals. These will have a morale value based on the scenario, and whenever you lose the capital, you lose that many morale points. And the person gaining it gains that many morale points. There's also some other effects for the capital. Okay, during combat, every 50 points of morale that you have above the other player is worth a die roll shift modifier, whatever. However, you're allowed to make those donations that I talked about. For every point of money that you give, it increases your morale for that battle by 1. And the limitation there is you can't spend more than 99 more than the other player. I think I just said 99. That's not the case. Okay. Some powers dissolve. Well, first of all, anytime a power's morale is reduced to 0 or less, it dissolves. Wow, that morale stuff's important, isn't it? Yeah, it sure is. And you have to keep attacking or your morale keeps going down. If you're the weaker power, it puts you, it just puts you in a horrible position. So these scenarios actually often are decided long before the historical end date or whatever. One key battle can change the whole campaign. And that's not ahistorical. There are some effects of this that are ahistorical, which is that you can't maintain a defense. You can't kind of be on the defensive without your government just collapsing, which I think is a little too harsh. But we'll see that in play, and it may just be my way of interpreting it that makes it too harsh. Okay, minor powers. If a minor power's morale is 0, due to being conquered, a province being conquered, retreating before combat, or units or leaders being eliminated, it becomes a client of the power that did bad things to it. It gets a new morale of 50, and it's added to the power form. If it dissolves for some other reason, it becomes inactive and neutral. Everything outside its provinces is placed back in its provinces. And it gives back anything it's owned. It gives back any accrued replacement points. However, if an enemy is still inside of it, it immediately reactivates. So if you invaded an enemy, you're not going to take them out by destroying their morale. This is different from some other things. If a major power, which is not a Roman faction, dissolves, it immediately becomes an inactive, neutral, minor power. You're basically out of the game. If all of a player's major powers dissolve, you're out of the game. Each of the client states becomes a client state of the nearest major power. Client states can be taken over by non-Roman powers. Okay. If a Roman faction dissolves, the imperator is removed from play. The provinces will defect to the closest, to essentially what amounts to the closest Roman faction. And then there's a whole sequence of what actually defects to. And it's really just procedural. I'm not going to worry about it until and unless it happens. When forces, which go with the province, defect, or outside the province for that matter, half of the forces are removed. The remainder all become part of the new owner's forces. Now, you got to be careful here, because the next thing is, well, there's some more rules on this, but the next rule is acquiring a color. Whoever's going to gain control of the largest number of units in a color gains control of that color. And they get to leave their units the same color on the board if they wish. Now, here's the reason that's a big deal, because the CERs of the two colors might be different. And you can't increase the CER. Like if an A-rated faction takes out a B-rated faction and is going to gain those forces, if it doesn't get the color, it may not be able to take the units on. If it's only an A-rated color itself, it won't be able to upgrade those units from B to A. However, if it gets the color, it can just leave them on the board. It still has that B-rated color. Okay. Fortifications. I seldom see these. I've certainly played with them, but I've certainly used them, but not much. Infantry units can build fortifications, mainly because of the 5 points lost for not attacking. Every 4 stacking points of infantry can build 1 level of fortifications. And you can build as many steps as you have 4 stacking points at a time. This is going to cost you money. It's listed on the mobilization chart. So there's a max level, how many fort points you can have there, and the cost per level. And then the cost for baggage trains is also on that same chart. And basically what happens is you get a little pick and shovel marker voices on top of the fortifications that you're trying to build, and they get put into place if that pick and shovel stays there without you moving or getting driven away at the beginning of your next movement phase. If you don't have units in a fortification, it comes off the map during your tax and mobilization segment unless you choose to pay a number of talents equal to its fortification level to leave it there. They cannot be captured. And you can always voluntarily remove almost everything in this game. Baggage trains, fortifications, maybe not plunder markers, but has a countermix limitation. If all the fortifications are on the board, if you can't build it, hey, too bad. That's not, that's not something that gets resolved. You can't make counters for it or anything, which is a little weird. But now, if a fortification is at the maximum level, well, first of all, the fortification's effect is to add its strength to the units in it, which doesn't seem like a lot. But if the fortification's at max level, it becomes a mini city. The units in the hex can take siege in it. If the fort is assaulted, the combat strength is doubled or tripled. They can forage from it as though it's got as many forage value as its level. Both sides can conceivably have a fortification in the same hex when, well, maybe not. Both sides can be present in the same hex during a siege, and the attacker in the siege can build a fortification. You can also build it in a friendly city hex and increase the friendly defenses. So yeah, both sides can have it there. Okay. Let's see what's going on. Okay. So whatever the imperial capital is, it's going to need corn. And there are these corn symbols on the map in various locations. One of them is special up here in Chersonesus. Those 4 only apply when Byzantium is a capital. During each game turn during diplomacy, you have to check to see if you have enough corn. If you can give 5 corn to your capital, and you can talk to other people into letting you have corn that they have under their control, then you have no problem. However, if you can't count that many, you look at the corn rebellion table. Over here, and you make a roll to see whether there's a corn rebellion. If one happens, you get a couple of unseasoned 212 light infantry in the imperial capital. They're not yours. They're going to be whoever has units closest to the imperial capital but doesn't own it at that point. And they become the new owners of the capital. They kick out whatever troops were in the capital, and morale switches hands. Now, obviously, they may not be able to hold it. Moreover, they may not be able to supply it with corn themselves. So you can see the capital sort of becoming this weird thing that changes morale on players and just sits there and flips back and forth until somebody manages to secure a corn supply. Inactive powers, basically, if something's considered inactive, the only way to activate it is usually to have it invaded. And there are powers that are not specified in the game. So, for example, this early scenario, Germania, is not specified. But because it's a wild province, it'll generate barbarians. And there's a procedural means of handling that. For the most part, players have no real reason to go picking on these, although it might be a way, if you're trying to defend in a war, pick on some minor area that has very few forces, likely, and being able to defeat that might allow you to maintain. But that means that a significant amount of your force has to go deal with them, and you probably need that force on your defensive operation. It's possible some factions are divided up into places where something like that's necessary, though. We'll just kind of leave it at that. Plunder. After a siege, if you have an unbesieged infantry or heavy cav in a province's capital city, after the siege phase, you're allowed to plunder the entire province. Now, the optional rules go on a per city basis. You put a plunder 2 marker on the province, you get 3 times the province's tax value, and the next 2 taxation and mobilization phases it's not going to produce, and the plunder marker will get reduced instead. It's not going to produce. I don't know if I said reduce. If you plunder a province you actually own, you will never be allowed to raise units in that province for the remainder of the game. You also only get half taxes from that province. Other players do not suffer this penalty. And plundering a province that you do not own, but you happen to own the capital of, which is possible. We didn't really go into the provincial ownership rules. Again, that's a procedural type thing. Forage values are halved while a province is plundered. You cannot accumulate supply points in a baggage train. I don't remember if I told you under the supply rules, if a baggage train parks in Yeah, I think I gotta look this up. I think it's a city under your control, a city in a province under your control. They can gain, each turn it occupies a friendly unbesieged city and neither moves nor expends supply points. It gains a supply point. Well, you don't do that when you're in a plundered city. And you can only gain up to the maximum 3 supply points or whatever. If a barbarian power plunders a province, it gets morale points equal to the tax value. The cities in plundered provinces will not have an intrinsic defense strength while it's plundered. And there's a modification for siege attrition in plundered provinces. If a province one power controlled at the beginning of the game or gained through dissolution ends up plundered by another power, the first power's morale is reduced by half the province's tax value. I bet you I won't remember that. That sounds like the kind of rule I'm going to forget. Victory for the game. All right. So normally there's a historical end date to these scenarios. The game ends then, and you assess whether or not anybody has victory. Scenario descriptions might indicate that if a certain number of people reach their victory conditions, or some other condition occurs, but this is the most likely, the game can end at that point. The players involved declare a victory. It is possible to have multiple winners. It's also possible to have no winners. The scenario we're going to look at can very easily end in a stalemate. If all factions but one are dissolved, that faction wins. If all factions dissolve, everyone loses. Players are allowed to extend scenarios beyond historical end date or end the game sooner if they all agree to. Now, this is, again, not just a formality of, yeah, you know, if you want to play longer or you don't want to play, feel free. At least the first part, which is extending the game. It's quite possible that no one is winning the game, that the game has not been decided, that the major battle hasn't happened in the time allotted. I have never seen this happen. Usually the games end way before their historical end date, not just because I'm bloody-minded, but because the morale rules incentivize you to fight, even if it might seem like it's better to try to defend. Your situation generally doesn't improve by building more troops while your morale is dropping. Just the nature of the combat chart. Now, if you can find a small attack to make somewhere and avoid running away from combat, but still avoid combat, this can all kind of work out for you. If you can find a front where you can be successful while you're retreating on another front, this can all work. But in general, you're usually facing one opponent, and that one opponent is, you really just have to fight them, and it gets decided within a couple turns, you know, not within 10 years or whatever the scenarios generally take. All right, I am going to break there as we go into the special rules. And yeah, we might get quite far here. Special rules is a section of rules that are basically scenario rules in a large extent, but they cover more than one scenario. So rather than rewriting them, they compiled them over here. Let's start looking at some of the special rules. We already looked at the civilized recruitment. It's a combination of money and replacement points, whatever. Both have to be spent. It doesn't rely on the mobilization charts. Pirates and roads. So some of these are not going to apply to the first scenarios we play, and I'll talk about them very lightly at most. But this one is going to be covered in the first couple of scenarios I'm going to be doing, because I'm going to do things chronologically, at least for a while. So there are a bunch of these pirate ships out there, and they each come with a dude. Setup is there. Mithridates is always the controller. This one really is, I mean, it only covers 2 scenarios because Pompey knocks out the pirates eventually, and I think there may be different rules for those pirates anyway, because this is only covering pirates in a very early stage and things. Pirates are a little better at attrition. They treat non-coastal city hexes as ports for some rules that I don't know. 10.2, 10.4. Yeah, they're able to land in them and debauch and revelry. And 16.15. Damned if I know what that is. 16.15. Well, that doesn't even make sense. So that may be a misreference. Pirates have to stay within 12 movement points of their starting hexes. Not their individual starting hexes, but all the pirate starting hexes. They range from here over to here. They can make amphibious invasions, but they have to keep their infantry unit with the fleet. They're not affected by morale, although other forces can gain morale by gain or lose morale by combat with pirates. Okay, and their big effect is during taxation and mobilization, if there's a pirate in the province, the tax value goes down by 1 for each such pirate. Each such hex occupied by pirates. And pirates within 15 naval movement points of a corn-producing province can prevent that corn from being used by Rome. And that's 1 corn symbol per pirate fleet involved. So that could cause real difficulty for whoever owns Rome, which at this point is Sulla, I believe. Okay. Well, Rhodes is similar. They have a couple of units which are doubled in strength against pirates, and they can't be used against Romans. Okay. Roman civil wars. This is honestly almost the default scenario. And it takes care of the leader. If the imperators are all killed, it forces dissolution. And you get 2 morale points for owning an imperial capital at the end of your player turn, which is kind of nice because you've got to deal with the corn revolts and you could be losing those. Some of the others, militia. We'll maybe touch on these as we get closer, but basically whoever owns a province has some additional strength points they can use in a fight outside of a city. Limitani, provinces that are on the border, may slow down movement of enemy forces. They have to spend an extra some extra movement points. Legion reform. Starting in scenario 18, the legions are formed at half strength as usual, but they can never season. Everything else works normally. And a legion's stacking value drops down to 2 because they're just smaller. Overruns. At some point, heavy cav show up, and they're going to be allowed to conduct overruns. if the total combat strength of the moving heavy cav is 5 times the defending forces. Corn under Byzantium, that opens up, it changes where the corn is available, basically. And that's just for the late scenarios. One scenario has this special rule for fleet conversion. You can replace a fleet with a legion unit. Training. Okay. Training's an interesting one when we get to it, but basically heavy units have to be trained. Heavy Roman, well, heavy non-barbarian, non-minor. The training requires that you have a unit of the same type and not weaker, which means like a full strength 1610 qualifies for a 1010. Veteran unit, which is present when you mobilize the new heavy unit. You'll drop it in training marker on the combined stack, and if you're not able to do that, you have to spend double to create your new heavy units. This is a really interesting facet. It actually changes the nature of being able to shuffle troops to the frontier very quickly. It makes the East a little more powerful because it has more money and can afford not to train. But what it really kind of does is make somebody with a large money and manpower base, but not a lot of initial troops, even weaker than they are to begin with. And that's actually one of the problems with the game. Roman archers. Okay, so archers don't have any effect without the optional rules, but essentially this makes the parenthesized and unparenthesized units the same when it's in play. List of neutral minor powers. These are powers that are available in certain scenarios. Let's make sure there's nothing in this first one, not yet. So they don't have to put the setup in all the scenarios. Special leader rules. A leader in certain scenarios, and the second one is going to have this, can walk on water, 3 movement points per hex. They act as if they're on land during it. However, they can be attacked while they're at sea by a fleet. There's special naval leaders here for Pompey, Sextus Pompeius, Agrippa, and Belisarius. They all get a bonus on combat and attrition at sea. Divine intervention. If you use this optional rule, Caesar and Sextus Pompeius each get a bonus on the divine intervention rolls. Yeah, it's kind of a wacky rule, but I like it. I use it because it's, I don't know, crazy. Okay, into the optional rules. Random events. Now, these happen during the interphase on turns where the interphase exists. I got it over here, the little white thing, 4 times a year. And basically, for each player, well, for each major power, because a player could conceivably control more than one, but we won't see that happen much, if at all, because I'm going to fill these games with the maximum players. Or, if not the maximum, so for example, the maximum in this first scenario is 4, but its optimal is 3. But I think I might actually go to 4 because weakening Mithridates seems like a good idea. Anyway, you roll a die, you read the rules on it, and there's a whole bunch of funky stuff that can happen. Optional combat rules. Okay, so this is how missile units become important, as well as cavalry. If you have at least twice as many missile units as your opponent, you get 1 bonus to your die roll in combat, and the same thing for cavalry, but they're not cumulative. Which is to say they'll cancel each other out, but you can't get a 2-point bonus. Optional city rules. I'm not going to do this. It changes the amount of money that each city gets. Each city is specific for that. Each has its own defenses. We're worried about each city as an individual entity. I think it adds a layer of complexity to the game that I don't want to cope with, and it just makes things uglier. However, conquest of cityless provinces, maybe. Normally you have to subdue a province. Well, this allows you to take it one level later and pull your troops out of the province. The cost, and I see no reason not to do this, it makes life easier. The cost to do it, you have to build a maximum level fortification for one for every 7 hexes in the province. And then you designate one of those as a city. And if that city is ever taken by someone else, they conquered the province. The tax value remains 0, however, and you can pull your heavy unit garrison out of the area. You've got it weighted down. Divine intervention. Before battle, before you roll a die for any reason in the game, you can roll on the deity appeals table. It cannot be used for rolls on the deity appeals table. Season change, which I'm a little disturbed with. Basically, I didn't talk too much about the seasons, but there's a chance that April and November are summer, and otherwise they're either spring or fall or winter. Well, otherwise they're winter, because we don't have the two. So you're not actually allowed to pray for that, which seems like a thing you'd want to pray for. You're not allowed to pray for random events, which seems like a thing you're allowed to pray for. In general, what it means is you can pray for battle. I guess attrition rolls, stuff like that. You roll on here. You have different results if you're polytheistic or monotheistic. And you might get a bonus on the dice in your favor. You might also get some problems. So, for example, the monotheism, you could lose 10 morale. Here you get a penalty on the die roll. Here you get executed in both cases. Yeah, pretty nasty. Generally, it's not something you want to do unless you're in trouble. And they specify who are monotheists and who are polytheists. Treasure cities, I'm not going to play with this either. It's again, it's basically there's a pile of money for taking certain cities. And if you take it in a city that you controlled, you'll lose a big pile of morale points. It's something else to keep track of, and I don't think it affects play all that much, although in some circumstances it might be a big deal to be able to haul the amount of money that you get out of here. What is it? It's 3 times the city's tax valuable. I would not use this without the optional city rules and the variable values, because they're kind of linked together, and that's the main reason for not doing it. I just don't want that chart. There's enough charts and record keeping in this game as it is, and I don't think that one adds a hell of a lot. All right, so then we'll start this first scenario, which is the Marius versus Sulla, and I don't know when. I may get it started tonight, but I've got to do packing and stuff like that, or unpacking. I'm just in such, you know how I got paralyzed about, long before I made the move, if I mentioned this, I got paralyzed about trying to select a move or a moving option, whether I was going to drive it, what date I was going to go, all kind of stuff like that. Any kind of decision making like that in my real life is just horrible. And I'm not terribly good at it in games either. I get paralyzed in the same way, but it's much, much less painful, for me at least. My opponents are kind of like, geez, dude, just take a move. It doesn't really matter. And it does to me. I'm unable to process. It's an executive dysfunction problem. Anyway, let's end it up.